I'm Dean Amel. I'm chair of Arlington's Urban Forestry Commission, and I'm the vice chair of the local Sierra Club group, which is called the Mount Vernon Group.
My name is Ellen Cecile McBarnette. I am the former Green Committee chair for the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. and former federal lobbyist for the Sierra Club and current owner of Urban Solar Solutions, a green consulting business in Washington, D.C. Please join us for conversation. Urban Solar Solutions started off as a retail business in Washington, D.C. and Prince George's County. And from its inception, the most popular product was always our expertise. And so we've narrowed down to consulting and have been consulting now for 6 years in the area. I started off in environmental justice in the Sierra Club, and I love the Sierra Club. Oh gosh, you guys do great work. You're former chair for Arlington, or former chair for which area of Sierra?
Well, the Mount Vernon group covers Arlington, Alexandria, and kind of the eastern part of Northern Virginia. Yeah. Yeah, and I've been active in the club for a long time. I was on their National Finance Committee for 15 years, which was a fascinating experience. But
wow.
Yeah, it's a nice mix of volunteers and staff, and you really need both, I think, to make a group effective. I
definitely agree.
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. But yeah, Arlington has this community energy plan that was passed a couple years ago. Jay Fassett, a member of the county board, started the process, and what the plan committed to do was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Arlington by 80% by 2050. Cool. Jay put together a committee that had, it wasn't just the normal tree hugger types. You know,
yeah.
it was big landowners in Arlington, some of the biggest developers, and so it was a good cross section of the community, and it got buy-in from everyone. And I think what came out of that process is that it really isn't. It's not a revolutionary thing really to reduce greenhouse gases by that much. Buildings have gotten progressively more efficient over time.
Yeah.
And lots of developments in Arlington has grown so much in recent years, and traffic on our local street hasn't increased because it's because of smart development, concentrating development along the metro corridors, encouraging bikes and other things. We've really had growth without an increase in transportation and the greenhouse gases that come from transportation. Sure. So I think what this process pointed out really is that you can have a big reduction in pollution without having to degrade your lifestyle. And I think the solar energy, I can't remember the exact amount of solar energy that is in the plan, but there's a lot of photovoltaic involved on the larger rooftops in Arlington.
Dying to hear about it, but also dying to hear about the distributed side of the energy, because so often when people think of solar, they think of it on one great big flat roof, like on top of a school building or on top of a hospital. But solar can also be installed on very sloped roofs, very different roofs of different types of shapes, and also can be really effective in the residential areas. DC has a wonderful program which incorporate grant funds given directly to homeowners to assist in those installations. But so does Maryland. Maryland's state program has been around certainly since 2009.
Right.
Is there something similar here in Arlington or Virginia itself?
Well, Virginia is not as progressive as DC or Maryland. So the incentives for photovoltaic are not as strong, but there are local programs. There's a local nonprofit called Arlingtonians for a Clean Environment that had a program encouraging people to have solar hot water heaters, and they would actually help with the installation and really push things forward and arrange for contractors. So kind of doing the pre-screening of the contractor for the homeowner just to make the process a little easier for people. So there's been a lot of solar hot water heating done in Arlington. Also, there's one guy in Arlington named Scott Sklar, who's
I know. Go ahead.
Yeah. And have you ever been to his house?
No, no.
Well, his entire yard is kind of like solar collectors everywhere. I mean, on the garage, on the house, on next to the driveway. I mean, he's totally off the grid, and he shows just what you can do on a standard Arlington house.
Yeah.
With trees around. It's not like he had to sacrifice that in order to do the solar, and it is very possible. And so I think a lot of what the energy plan is trying to do is beyond solar. They're also looking at things like geothermal, which is very easy to do for homeowners. Much easier for homeowners probably than for...
Well, I imagine much easier in Arlington than in D.C. I live in a D.C. row house, and I'm told that geothermal can be installed in my 30-foot by 18-foot backyard. Yeah, that's the entire yard, by the way. I know that's a closet in some places in Arlington, but but I understand with the larger yards, you have a better access to the ground.
Right, or even what I was thinking to do is we have a gravel driveway, and you could maybe do it in the driveway next time we have to replace our furnace. Amazing. Just to reduce energy that way. And the other thing that the energy plan is doing is it's talking about these district energy systems or combined heat and power systems. One thing I hadn't really realized is that any big power plant, whether it's coal or gas fired or however it's fired, more than half of the energy is wasted just as waste heat going up the smokestack. And then there's more wasted on the transmission lines getting from that distant power plant to the DC area. But the loss just in heat at the plant is what's really huge. And if you have these district energy systems, the idea is you put in a small plant in an urban area and you capture all that waste heat and use that for the nearby buildings.
I grew up in New York, and there was such a system in New York from, I think it was from the 1800s. And you can still see the steam rising out of some of the manhole covers, because that is exactly what they're doing, is using the furnace heat, essentially, to heat hot water, to heat additional buildings. I hear that they do that near the White House, too. The old executive office building, is that what you've heard?
I work in a government office building downtown, and we have that kind of a system. Now, apparently, those steam systems are not state-of-the-art. Now, these days, they use hot water, which is somehow more efficient than the steam, but it's the same idea. And you can run air conditioning with it. Again, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know how you convert the heat into air conditioning, but it's
someone explained it to me once, and it was pretty impressive. So it's doable.
So that, I think that gets you just a huge gain in energy efficiency just by having these small, and you don't even know that there's a small power plant in one of these office buildings. It's not your classic thing with the big stacks coming up and
no coal smoke coming out.
That's one of the things that the local Sierra Club group has been working on lately. Was there was this power plant in Alexandria, right on the Potomac River shore, Brant power plant, which was coal burning, is one of the biggest point sources of pollution in the DC area. So we started a campaign to try to shut that plant down. And that eventually succeeded, I think, in large part due to changes in federal law.
I was at the climate rally a few months ago. It was freezing cold.
Yes, I remember.
we started chanting about that power plant, about that was a success in our area. And thank you all, because that plant affected Prince George's, it affected D.C. Air quality, you can feel it, you could smell it, is what I was told.
And just the deposition on nearby buildings, people would get up in the morning and there'd be, ash all over their cars or on their windows and even inside their homes. So that was a great success. But we really have to move beyond, we have to continue to shut down coal plants like that. But I think these days there's a lot of movement toward natural gas plants, which are an improvement, but it's still creating greenhouse gases. And so, in the movement of gradually going toward, I think, solar power and geothermal and other things, natural gas is maybe a stepping stone, but you have to keep moving beyond that.
What are some of the challenges you face in reaching out to, well, I think of Virginia, I should warn you, coming from DC, I think of Virginia as a relatively conservative state, and I get a little concerned coming across the water. But what are the challenges do you have in reaching out to not only the folks in Arlington, but the folks in Richmond? How do you deal with the very sometimes resistant folks?
I wish I had a good answer to that. It can be very difficult. You know, because Virginia is this Dillon Rule state, Arlington has to get permission to do things from Richmond that in most states they could just do on their own. The locality could do it on their own without getting state permission. And there are a lot of things we would like to do, such as putting on a bag tax on plastic bags or things like that. Which,
we've got one, DC.
I know, and parts of Maryland, and it's incredibly successful.
Yeah, very much so.
You know, and when you do stream cleanups, you see what a problem they are, how much litter and how much damage they do to the local environment. So I don't really know how to change Richmond. Now that we've closed down the Morant power plant, the Sierra Club has turned its attention to Dominion Virginia Power, which is our local electric utility. It's one of the most powerful players in Virginia politics.
It would be, yes, utilities.
Now, I can't remember what the issue was, but there was some issue a few years ago where we were going to try to hire a lobbyist to work on a particular issue, and we found out that Dominion had basically already signed up every energy lobbyist in Richmond and put them all on retainer. You know, and there was like none of the normal firms would even talk to us because they had already been hired up by the other side. So in order to turn Dominion power, you're not going to do it by convincing the legislature to do something against Dominion's wishes. You have to create public pressure. And go to the stockholders meetings. Create a next. I think it's actually next Saturday.
Soon.
or tomorrow. There's a large rally in Richmond.
What would that date be? Would that be the 20th then?
No. Actually, I think it's actually tomorrow. So it'll be after this show is on the air. But they're doing the electric slide outside Dominion's power plant, trying to get hundreds and hundreds of people to do the electric slide. That's what you need to get media attention.
Oh, if I could, I would so show up to that. That would be fun.
And so you're trying to convince Dominion to move a little bit toward solar and away from fossil fuel power. I mean, you talked about all the work you're doing on solar installations. In Virginia, that is much harder to do, and I don't know if you've ever tried to work in Virginia.
Well, I have. The consulting for my business is broader. It goes into energy efficiency, and actually I do sustainable landscaping as well. But I do have a project that I started in Prince George's and have done a little tiny bit in Virginia, and I'm now writing a book based on. And that is, the name of the book is The Sustainable Church. And what the project is a way of bringing a new set of folks into the environmental movement. Certainly, churches have been involved in the environmental movement since the movement began. Almost every social justice movement of worth has had a religious component associated with it. But the sustainable church is a way to reach beyond the churches that often are already involved, very liberal churches, shall we say, to the more conservative ones, the ones who are resistant to environmental concerns, as they often see it as Gaia worship and as being contrary to, in the case of a church, to Christian fundamentalism, to full belief in the one true God and the focus on the afterlife. They see it as too worldly. In the case of other religious traditions, there's also different types of resistance. And what the Sustainable Church does is assists individual houses of worship in maximizing their energy efficiency, also the efficiency with water use and reducing their waste. And by doing so, one can show the congregants, the individuals who are attending these churches, the benefits in a very financial format of actually taking these steps. For instance, usually one of the top 3, it can be one of the top 10, but it can be as high as the top 3, budget line items for churches is utilities.
Sure. They're big places to heat. High ceilings, yeah.
And they have unique lighting concerns. For instance, the National Cathedral drops more than $1 million a year simply on electricity.
Wow.
So just reduce, and you know the level of reduction going from incandescent bulbs and inefficient furnaces to high efficiency LEDs and high efficiency furnaces can be 70% or more in reduction of energy production. That kind of change broadcast among these congregants is just an amazing example for their own lives. And so I'm wondering if, it's a long-term thing, but I'm wondering if that might be a way of influencing Dominion Power in their own backyard.
That's an excellent idea, because that's something that could play throughout Virginia. We're working in many different ways to get at Dominion, and we are working. There's an Interfaith Power and Light group.
Love them. Joel Novy. Lovely.
And they're active in Virginia. And helping on a number of environmental issues.
Yes.
One thing that we do in Arlington as well is on tree planting. The county has this tree canopy fund, which takes money from developers. When the developers put up a new site plan, a big office building, and they can't plant all of the trees on that property that are required by county code, they pay money into this fund, which Arlington then, actually gives to a nonprofit called Arlingtonians for a Clean Environment, and groups, either like apartment buildings or neighborhood associations or churches, can apply to get funds from that tree canopy fund to plant trees on their property. And we've done that with a number of churches in Arlington, and it can make a huge difference. They've got generally big property. A lot of times it's very open, and just planting trees around their parking lots can, I think, maybe impress people on how much that can help keep your car and the area cooler in the hot summer days than otherwise. And so there are a number of ways where we're trying to work with the faith community to move environmental issues forward.
Fabulous. I'm excited. In my own research, I've been finding that there are large communities that turn to the church for information before they turn to any other source, media, politicians. There's a reason that politicians tend to campaign in churches every political cycle. But one of those groups are the immigrant groups. Often are looking to, certainly in the Hispanic community, Spanish language churches are very influential. I hear that there's a very large immigrant community here in Arlington.
Oh yes, and it's probably an area where we should be doing better outreach. I mean, when we were trying to shut down the Morant plant, succeeding in shutting down the Morant plant, one of the things we did was have a hair testing event where you clip off a little bit of someone's hair and test it for mercury, because mercury is one of the nastier pollutants that come out of coal power plant stacks. And we did reach out to the faith community and tried to reach out to the minority and immigrant communities there to broaden the message. And the results were the hair was sent to a lab. The results were sent back, and for obvious reasons they were kept private, only sent to the person who
health information. It makes sense.
That's right. But I think we had overall statistics on what percentage showed that mercury was above a safe level, and it was substantial. And so that's, I think you try to get at people in ways that appeal to their financial self-interest or their personal health issues, and maybe get them more involved in green issues that way. But I think the financial area is one place that we really should be working more on. And I was wondering, when you do your work, there can be a huge upfront expense, or a big upfront expense on solar installations. And even though it pays off over the long run,
Yeah.
you have to come up with that money up front. And how do you, when you're dealing with your clients, how do you address that kind of issue?
Well, DC is a little different because we have net metering. We also have a requirement that Pepco, which is the utility that services the entire of the city essentially, for electricity, purchase back a certain amount of the renewable energy credits for reducing the carbon that would have been used to create the same amount of energy that the solar panels are producing. Instead of those credits being, expelled into the air, essentially. The homeowner or the owner of the panels, is a better way of putting it, the owner of the panels, receives a kind of like a paper credit in the dollar amount. And it's a set dollar amount, usually by negotiation over the wider area. It gets to be a little complicated economic term, but the credits can be as high as $300 per kilowatt, and I've heard as high as $1,000 per kilowatt in some areas. But they're relatively generous. If you have, there's at least one house in DC, and this is just the DC row house that I know of, that has 9 kilowatts on the rooftop.
Wow.
And so then renewable energy credits that that person is receiving, I'm not going to hazard a guess, but it could be substantial. So those credits can be bundled. I'm sure that Pepco is not going to be interested in just 9 kilowatts. They want to purchase 9,000 kilowatts at a time. But there are entities that purchase those credits from the homeowners, actually give them a check.
Okay.
Again, I shouldn't say homeowner, I should say the owner of the panels, because that becomes important later.
Right.
But they purchase those credits from, you know, the panel owners. And that's one way that a panel owner can receive funds. But then there's also net metering, which is in which the utility essentially pays for the energy that's generated. Because when one is on the grid, we're not talking about off-grid installations in an urban area like DC. There are a few houses that are off the grid. There are a couple that I know of. There may be more than that. I know of 2. But with most people want to have access to electricity at times or in ways that even a battery backup system cannot provide. So what they're really doing by having solar panels on their roof is reducing the amount of coal-fired plants or natural gas plants or, you know, God forbid, nuclear power plants are producing by producing some energy of their own in the form of solar, you know, photovoltaics. And what Pepco does is reward them by saying, okay, you're putting this amount of energy into our grid, then we're going to let your meter run backwards. And you can actually see your bill and see how much you've produced. Ideally, it doesn't always work quite this well. See how much you've produced and see not only how much less you're paying Pepco, but in a really fabulous scheme of things, see how much Pepco now is paying you if you're producing that much electricity. In the long run, combine that with some of the energy tax credits that were wonderfully generous, the federal credits and state credits, and the grant program from DC. Used to be a third. It's dropping a little bit because solar is falling in price. One can install for very cheaply.
You can?
Very cheaply. Well, assuming that you can come up with the upfront cost. Now, the issue of the upfront cost is an issue for anyone, you know, in our normally middle-class world.
I'm guessing that's why you're distinguishing between the household and the panel owner.
Yes. Because now, as solar has become more sophisticated, you know, the solar industry has become more sophisticated. We now have companies that will actually own the panel and lease the power. Essentially, it's like having a mini utility sitting on your roof. And so you're still buying electricity, but your electricity is produced by the panels that are sitting on your roof. Those lease options, very often they will allow the ownership of the panel eventually to convey to the homeowner. But during the time period that the panel is being owned by someone else, the lease to own arrangement, the renewable energy credits are going to them. So I do recommend and have in the classes that I've taught, recommended to homeowners who can to actually do their own installation and receive these benefits themselves. But understanding that not everyone can come up with $10,000 to $40,000 at a pop.
Right.
One great bit of news, though, is when I first started in the consulting business, panels were going for, I think it was more than $9 a watt. And now they're less than $1 a watt.
Yeah.
And so as demand increases, production's increasing, the quality of panels in some areas are increasing. That's a whole other conversation. We could talk for a half hour on that alone. But yeah, it's getting better and better for us all, I think.
Now there are some problems with Virginia with the great picture you painted for DC and Maryland.
Okay.
First of all, I know two things. I know that in Virginia you can only do the net metering up to a very small scale. So I think it's up to 10 is a kilo. I don't know what the
but a relatively low proportion of what you're producing.
It's basically one household. You know, you can't go all out and have a huge installation on, say, an office building.
Yeah.
That's, you know, not allowed. You know, Dominion doesn't have to do the net metering. And I know Washington and Lee University, which is downstate somewhere, went through one of these arrangements that you discussed where they, because it's a nonprofit university, they had no use for the tax credits.
Yes.
So they hired this other firm, or signed a contract with this other firm to install the panels on their buildings and to get the tax credits. And Dominion blocked them because they said that under Virginia law that made, I guess, the panel installer a utility, and they weren't a licensed utility, and so they actually prevented Washington Lee University from putting those solar panels on.
That is a huge disappointment.
I know. I mean,
oh my goodness.
You know, and that's one thing that, you know, we've been trying to change in the legislature. And I think there was a tiny advance this year in which they let farmers like put their own or go through these arrangements or have more than the small limit on a solar system on their farms, because you know, everyone loves farmers, right? You know, and then I guess even rural Virginia legislators like farmers, whereas they don't like, you know, energy efficiency in general.
Well, I have a story that might help in the future. If when you finally find a lobbyist who will take your job, you should call me, by the way. I was an energy lobbyist in DC, and I used to live not far from Richmond. But another story. But University Park in Maryland, a group of individuals formed a solar cooperative in which they owned the panels, and they had installation on property owned by a church. And then in Washington, D.C., the Florida Avenue Baptist Church, it was a coalition of the members of the church who were the owners of the panels. So they received, this investment group received funds, you know, from the renewable energy credit. So it doesn't have to be a large corporation coming in and, you know, but it can also be investment groups that work together and do these installations. And other churches have been really interested in these arrangements because, as you say, nonprofit organizations like churches can't take advantage of the tax credits, and they can be quite generous. So I wonder if reaching out to the religious community and helping them to understand that this is a loss of opportunity for them personally, but also for their congregants to make money that's available, that's out there. Maybe that might be another community who could lobby in coalition with you all on this, exactly this subject.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I mean, I really think that that's something that I know that, you know, our staff down in Richmond have worked with faith community to some extent, but that's the kind of thing that we really should focus on to a greater extent. And
Joelle Novi at Interfaith Power and Light has a wonderful publication about solar power in churches, specifically for churches. And she talks about some of these examples, and there are probably more examples than I am thinking of off the top of my head now.